Well, comrades, brothers and sisters, what a fantastic turnout. And by the way, what a fantastic panel of speakers you've heard today. Give them a big round of applause. It reflects two things. It reflects the best people in our movement and the best voices within our movement. It also reflects the respect that people have for this union and what we've done and what we do in every single fire and rescue service across the country. Let's be clear, we're only at the start of our ballot. We have got an amazing turnout today. People have travelled from the length and breadth of the United Kingdom. We see Region 2, Northern Ireland, in the smartest turnout, setting you all a challenge for the next time we are here. Because let's be clear, if they don't listen today, we will be back, and we'll be back in greater and greater numbers until we force them to listen. Let's not underestimate the seriousness of what we are doing. Nobody underestimates the challenge of holding a strike ballot and calling a strike in the fire and rescue service. None of us want to be there, but sometimes it's the only thing that you can do, and that moment is now. So this is going to be a challenge. We faced a hostile government, and some of you, when you talk to MPs over there, you'll get mixed messages, and some of them will tell you, and I'll address it in a moment, there is no money to give you a pay rise. So we are in a very, very serious battle, and we have to prepare for that. FBU members, like millions of other workers, are facing a cost of living crisis. It's a paying the bills crisis. It's a paying the mortgage crisis. It's a crisis of whether we're going to be able to give presents to the kids at Christmas crisis. That's the scale of what people have told us as we've travelled the country over the past few months. Inflation has now passed 11%. 11.1% is the most latest figure on CPI inflation. And this government has no serious strategy to tackle that. But let's get one thing straight from the start. And when you're talking to MPs this afternoon, workers and workers' wages have got nothing to do with the inflation crisis that we're facing today, and we don't accept any blame, and we won't allow them to put the blame on you or postal workers or nurses or anyone else over the coming months. Instead, research shows that much of the inflation has been driven by the profit-seeking actions of big corporations, as others have touched on. So let's put the blame where it really lies, and let's demand that our government puts the blame and addresses it, rather than endlessly telling working people to tighten their belts again and again and again. Now, we've lived through three major crises, and it's all affected our service as well. In 2008, the banking system crashed the economy and crashed the world economy. And let's remember this when they tell you there's no money for pay rises. The bailout of the banks at its peak was over £1 trillion. For example, just in terms of the purchases of shares and loans, £124 billion was found, just like that, in a matter of weeks to bail out the banks. There was no question then that the country can't afford it. And then in 2010, the general election brought to power a coalition government, and they began to say, we've now got to pay for the bailout of the banks. And they introduced austerity. And let's be clear, austerity is just a word to describe policies to shift resources away from you and your families and other working people to those at the top. It means attempts to push down wages, a tax on pensions, a tax on jobs, a tax on public services, all to pay the price of bailing out the banks. Austerity in the fire and rescue service meant a tax on our pensions. It meant record attacks on jobs and positions in our service. It meant an attack on the service that we are able to provide to the public, so that we're getting to fires and emergencies slower than we were in 2012 all across the UK. And of course, it meant a tax on our pay. And then as soon as we began to emerge from so-called austerity, we were confronted by the terrible COVID pandemic. And let's remember, that has killed worldwide 6.6 million people. And in the UK, 212,000 people died from COVID. And I know that many people in this room will have been affected, from friends and family who died or became ill as a result. And let's remember, as professionals in an industry that deals supposedly with risk management, don't let them claim there were no warnings. They were told in 2008 through the National Risk Register of the risk of emerging pandemics in this country. And they should have planned, they should have prepared, but they did the absolute opposite. They should have invested in public services, in the health service, in local government, and yes, in the fire and rescue service. But they did the opposite. And let's remember, who saw society through COVID? Was it the people in the boardrooms of the banks shifting around billions of dollars each day to make as much money as they can? No, they were totally irrelevant. The people who saw us through COVID were workers in the public and the private sector, and we reject any false attempt to create divisions between those of us who work in the public sector and those who work in the private sector, because it's people working on some of the lowest wages, picking vegetables in a field, or working in food processing plants, or driving lorries, or working in supermarkets, who made sure people could eat during the pandemic. Workers in transport, workers in public services, and yes, workers in our own service as well, who saw our communities through those terrible times. And we should never forget what we did and what others did. While some people made a great deal of money from bent contracts, our people suffered, and we should never forgive those responsible. And in our own service, we stepped up. Firstly, we delivered the fire and rescue service and all the additional risks that meant. When people were asked to stay at home, our people were told to carry on going into work with all the risks that brings. And let's not forget, we have lost members as a result of COVID, and we remember them today as well. But many of our members, additionally, through negotiated agreements, through our much maligned National Joint Council, took on additional roles, delivering PPE, training people in the use of PPE, training ambulance drivers, driving ambulances, and in the starkest example, moving the bodies of the deceased in a number of fire and rescue services. We were called key workers at the time, along with others in the health service, other public services, and as I say, in the private sector. And the Prime Minister, just round the corner, came out and clapped. And we say to the clapping hypocrites in Downing Street, we don't want your applause, we want a pay rise, and so do other workers. When you meet MPs today, they will tell you there's no money. But in the mini budget just a few weeks ago, they found £45 billion, just like that, to hand out in tax cuts generally to the wealthiest people in society. The Bank of England found £64 billion to prop up the bond market. We found out that actually Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme, the fraud in that was £4.5 billion. That is more than the entire cost of the whole British Fire and Rescue Service. So don't let them tell you there is no money. They can find money for their friends, the spivs and parasites getting dodgy contracts from their mates and sitting in the House of Lords still. But they tell you there's no money. Now we had some of the finest representatives of the Parliamentary Labour Party here today. I thank John and Ian and Zara for their support today. I thank the FBU's parliamentary group who will support us, the Socialist Campaign group who will support us. But I say this to Keir Starmer. It's simply not good enough to ask for our votes, but sit on the fence when we demand fair pay. Should Labour MPs be on picket lines? Damn right they should be on picket lines. Now, I'm aware that chief officers have been out and about talking to many of you and your colleagues over the past few weeks and writing nice letters to people. And frankly, I say this. If you want to influence the Fire Brigades Union and our decisions, join the Fire Brigades Union or else keep your nose out of our business. We'll decide whether we go on strike or not. Now, we do not underestimate the seriousness of what we do or the challenges we face. It must remind us of the case for solidarity. These sometimes sound like old-fashioned words, unity and solidarity, but they are our values. Workers acting alone can achieve nothing. But when we act together, we can change things. Indeed, we can change the world. That means we value and respect each other as Ian has set out, regardless of who we are, what background we come from, race, ethnicity or heritage, sex, gender or sexuality. We stand together as trade union members in a common struggle for all of us for decent pay, and that unity has to run through every single thing that we do. We don't underestimate the seriousness of what we do or the challenges that we face. We've heard today from other unions. The cost of living crisis is affecting millions and millions of working people and their families. We don't allow them to play divide and rule between the public and the private sector. And when we've travelled the country, a lot of our members have said, are we going to coordinate action? And I'll say this, if we're facing the same attacks, absolutely, we should stand together with every other group of workers facing the same attacks. We march together. We march together, we strike together, and we picket together. So yes, we will be coordinating our action in the event of a yes vote in this ballot. Now, our members up and down the country are part of a proud and noble occupation. Let's remember for a minute what we do, because it's easy to trivialise it. We keep people safe. We keep our communities safe. Whether it's in our training centres or the planning departments looking at emerging risks, whether it's those out inspecting buildings to make sure they comply with legislation, whether it's in our emergency fire controls, where every incident starts and is the heart of every incident, or whether it's riding fire engines to incidents not knowing what we may face. That's what our members do. And our red plaques commemorate those who have paid the terrible price for what our people do. And we should never forget it. We should be proud of what we do, the job that we have taken up, the profession we have engaged in. And in return, we make no apology to anyone for demanding the appropriate equipment, the procedures, the training, the crewing levels. And yes, we make no apologies for demanding decent pay. We apologise to no one for doing that. So, comrades, I finish on this point. This is just the start of our ballot. You all have a task in front of you. We've got a task to go and speak to MPs, but you've got a bigger task, a task to speak to every one of your colleagues at work to make sure they vote in this ballot, to make sure they return that ballot, to make sure they vote yes in that ballot. We have never been given anything since we were founded as a union. Chief officers have never given us anything. Politicians in government have never given us anything. We've had to fight for every single improvement that we have won, from pensions to shorter hours to better pay to better conditions and safety provision. All of those things, this union, people who went before us, have had to organise and fight, and today is no different to that. So therefore, comrades, as we leave, we stand up together, we stand together, and we fight together. Vote yes. Thank you very much.